Just waiting for one more person to get in before we start. Here we go. All right, well, today this is the last session, and then I'm going to give you access to all of the handouts from all of the workshops. And I will also make sure at the end to give you a list of the list of all of the where the recordings will actually live. So the first thing I'm going to give you is a link to the handout. And then I'm also going to give you a link to a tracker that you can use to keep track of what you're doing in accessibility. And so that way you can have, if somebody asks you what you're doing, you can share that tracker with them, but it's also going to help you with how you can kind of keep up with what's going on. All right, I just wanted to make sure that I had all my links shared properly before I got any further. All right, so we are now in session 7. So this is the wrap-up session. So hopefully you've attended all 6 prior sessions, or at least you can catch up on the recordings afterwards. So you should have a working mental model of what accessibility remediation, means. And you probably don't have a great kind of rhythm for what you're doing as far as work is concerned. So you're kind of a workflow. So that's something that you're going to kind of think about. So we're just going to kind of walk through this and think about getting this workflow started for each of you. So this is the last session, and we've done Google and Word docs. We've done PowerPoint and Google Slides. We've done caption files. We've done alt text with Acorn. And we also did converting documents to PDFs. So today, what we're going to learn specifically is how to log your work, how to know when to escalate something to someone else without you becoming so frustrated that you are ready to throw your computer, which would be a bad thing. How to write clear notes. So when you're escalating it, exactly. So, and then when and where to find help. And then to getting that kind of rhythm going as you're working through accessibility documents. So I want to start by saying that documentation is and is not. It's not paperwork. It's not red tape. It's not extra work on top of your real work. Documentation is your evidence trail when the DOJ Title II compliance work needs to be reviewed, and it will. If this gets taken to any kind of litigation in a courtroom, we are going to have to prove what we've been doing, and that's why your documentation is important. It comes from logs like the ones we're going to look at, and it also helps you. When you come back to a ticket 2 weeks later, your past notes tell you what's done. When you hand it off to another work study student or up to a supervisor, your log makes that transition a whole lot easier instead of starting at 0 and trying to remember what you already did. When something goes wrong, your log also shows you and your supervisor actually what happened. So 5 minutes of logging after each ticket is going to save you hours of scrambling later. So kind of treat that as a part of the job and your workflow. So what to document? So your handout is going to include a documentation spreadsheet, and it's going to, I'm going to show it to you in just a second. And I have that, I just shared that with you in the Google, in the chat. So if you can't see that, let me know and I'll put them back in there again. But you're going to open the practice sheet and I'm going to show you what it looks like. And it's kind of wonky formatted, but we'll figure this out. All right. There we go. So you can see here, it kind of tells you in the first on the first page exactly what you need to do. Now, remember, you need to make a copy of this. You can't work in this because if you work in this, you're going to end up with everybody else's information too. So make sure you download this. That's your first step. And you're going to save it to your Google Drive, not OneDrive. Let's just remove that because we don't want to use that. You can also make this a Google spreadsheet if you would prefer. And that's going to be up to you. So now what I would like to do, let's make this a little easier to read. Oh, that's not better. That looks terrible. Wrap. Well, that's not what I wanted to do. Let's do it this way. There we go. Now we can see all the words. Sorry about that. All right, so this is what you're going to log. The date, the ticket ID. Now, if your campus doesn't have a ticket ID, then just start your own ticket numbering system and just call it 1 or O1. I would certainly suggest that you probably want to call this O1. Now, notice that when I hover over this, it says use year, month, day format. That just makes it easier to sort. So when you're doing it, you're going to go 2026. Oh, wrong month. I'm wishing it's June. And that's where we're going to go. And if I don't have a ticket ID, again, I'm going to start with O1, right? I'm not going to just start with 1. You want to start with O1 because if you don't, when you try to sort, when you get to 10 or anything above that, it becomes a problematic. So either start with 001 or O01. Totally up to you. Add the file name that you're working on. Add whoever created it. If it's faculty or staff, this should say faculty, course, or staff. And campus, if they're at a specific campus, most of our community colleges have different campuses. Germanna has 3, 4, right? And so if it's Stafford, you put Stafford. It's Fredericksburg, Fred, whatever. You want to make sure that you label which campus. Then you can tell them, say which original format it came in, the issues that you fixed, flagged items if you weren't able to fix anything, and about how much time you spent. That does not need to be exact, just ballpark it. And then if it's done, mark it done. If it's in progress, mark it in progress. And anything you want to say to your supervisor or anything that your supervisor might say about this, and you can share this with them. So I'm going to go ahead and look at this. So if notice I have on the original format, it's a drop down, makes it super easy. So is the status drop down, makes it easy, super easy to work with. So now here are some examples, right? So we have, if you don't know exactly how to fill in the log, this is what you're going to look at. Here's a template, except this doesn't look good. So let's fix this. Now, if you, your ticket numbering is going to probably be based off of your documentation. So just make sure that when you share the spreadsheet with your supervisor, you also explain your ticketing numbering system, right? And then you can see that there is one here, decisions above your pay grade. So if it is exactly that, then that's what you need to say. The 15 rule violation, if you spent 15 minutes with a nasty PDF and you need it as a Word document and you're struggling, that's when that rule would come into play. Missing source document, if you can't make the source document or it would be easier, you do need to tell somebody if you're converting something from a PDF into a Word document. That's going to be very helpful. And then you have this lovely tab here, which is your quarterly summary, which is going to let someone know. Now, all the formulas are already in here. They're already attached. The only thing you have to do is file, download, and download it either as, I would download this as Microsoft Excel. Now, if you want to put that in your Google Drive and then convert it to a Google Doc, you can. But actually, you know what? Let me just go ahead and do that and give you both. because that's just dumb. All right, hold on one second. Here is a Google Sheet. If you prefer to work in Google, I prefer to work in Google. But again, it's the exact same thing, your log, your examples, your escalation templates, and your summary. And all of that's linked together for you, so you don't have to worry about any of that. So again, if you're thinking about the time spent, right? We get to this time spent in minutes. You aren't, remember, 15 minutes is about, that's as long as you should be spending unless you feel like you can get it done and you need to spend a little more time. Now, if it's something, when you start this process, though, it's going to take you longer than 15 minutes. Honestly, I will say for a while, you should take as long as it needs to take to get something to completed state, because that's going to teach you the skills. By backing out and then moving to something else, after 15 minutes is really not teaching you actually how to remediate documents and do all of the things you need to do. Okay, so that's kind of, there are, like I said, there's 6 core fields. So this log template is going to have actually kind of information. You can decide where it wants to live, but remember, excuse me, that you must make a copy of it from the link that I gave you. All right, so now once we've kind of gotten that done, now let's talk about those. I already did this. Escalation tickets, right? So I gave you a document log in your session handout. Let's see. In case you didn't get the session handout, I will give you that again. There is the session handout that you can open and follow along if you want. So some tickets are just not really what you need to be working on. So let's decide what they are and flag them quickly and move on. So the first one is FERPA protected content. If you don't know what FERPA is, it is a privacy. It's privacy. It's things that you probably shouldn't be looking at. If you happen to receive something like that, then that's when you know that you need to just send that right on to your supervisor, right? All right. So when you open a ticket and you see student data in a document, stop. Unless your supervisor has specifically told you that you can work with that information, just stop. Do not finish the work. Do not upload anything. Just flag it and send it to your supervisor. So something like an example of that, grade roster with student names and grades, anything with a student ID and a photo of a student that shows names, course registration data, like if somebody sends you a whole list of courses and all of that, anything that, and staff information as well. If there's a staff name and email or staff information, you need to ask before you do anything with it. Okay, so those are the things that you need to make sure if you see them, you stop. The second one is a decision that is above your pay grade. So some tickets may ask you to make decisions that you're just not really in a position to make. A faculty member asks you if their entire course is accessible. That's not up to you to decide. They have a tool called You Do It that will scan it for them, and then they need to speak with their department chair or your supervisor. A document needs reorganization, not just remediation. That's also not something you have to do. A vendor product is inaccessible and someone needs to negotiate with the vendor, not your job. Vendor problems are faculty problems and institutional problems. So these are policy and program decisions. Flag them, send them up, and when in doubt, ask. I'm doing remediation or am I making a decision? If you're making a decision, then you might want to escalate the document. 15 minutes. So you learned the 15-minute rule on Monday. If a ticket would take more than 15 minutes, and again, I've said this is a caveat, this is once you get started and you're comfortable, then you can recreate from source or escalate. So you do need to ask before you recreate the source. And some tickets are honestly really just worse than that. You could receive a 200-page PDF from someone with no source file. It's a scanned image of an entire textbook chapter. That's going to take way more time and it shouldn't be done. So if you're receiving things like scanned in textbooks, that is something that you should not be remediating because that is a copyright flag. That needs to be sent to the supervisor, and the supervisor needs to speak with the library. So even if it is a shortcut and you think, oh, maybe this is not too bad, if you aren't sure, ask, right? And then the last thing is missing source documents. If the source document is missing and the content is technical, lengthy, specialized, like it has math equations that you have no idea about, charts that you aren't sure, complex tables, escalate. The faculty member or staff member may need to provide source files or accept the document needs to be rebuilt. For simple PDFs, then recreate it from scratch in Word is faster than trying to do it in Adobe or Pave. Then also, escalation is not a failure on your part. It is the right professional move. Knowing what is above your pay grade is part of your job. Your supervisor would much rather you flag and ask something than spend 3 hours and do it incorrectly. All right, so this is the section here that will keep you from losing your mind. So when you just need to recognize it and then you need to escalate. But I'm also going to walk you through how do you do that, right? So this is your FERPA related content. So these are the things that you want to concentrate on, right? So this is the first thing. Here's the second thing, some examples, right? Anything that has probably money in it, probably not for you to remediate. The 15-minute rule, again, this is going to come into play a little bit later. Right now, it's going to take you longer than 15 minutes because this is new. And the last one is finding those source documents or recreating it. So how do you write that escalation note? I don't want you to, when you're flagging your ticket, your supervisor is going to need a couple things. So what the ticket is going to ask for, why you're flagging it, and what you did before you're sending it to them. So keep it brief, 3 or 4 sentences. This is not paragraphs. This is not epistles. This is not grammar. This is not running it through with APA citations. This is literally 3 or 4 sentences, right? So those are the 3 things that you're going to make sure that you add when you are sending something to your supervisor. So flagging ticket 1, 2, 3, 4. Document contains a grade roster with student names and ID numbers. I've not opened it further or uploaded anything. Recommend reassignment to a staff member. Perfect. See, easy peasy, nothing. It's brief, it's specific, it's actionable. Flagging ticket 5678. The source PDF is 180 pages of scanned text from a vendor textbook. No source file available. Estimated remediation time exceeds 30 hours, even with the most efficient workflow. Recommend escalating to faculty or source file or replacing content. In other words, or speaking with the library. Right? Brief, specific, actionable. That's the pattern. 3 sentences, no drama, ready to send. You don't have to worry about it upsetting anyone. It's something that you need to make sure that you can do. Now, if I take a sample ticket and I'm going to, so we're going to I'm going to let you in the chat. How about we do it that way? I'm going to put in some information into our All right, I'm going to share my screen now, and I'm going to let you in the chat write a very brief escalating ticket that would take care of that. It's on your screen, so you don't have to open it, but 3 sentences. That's the whole skill. Ooh, wrong window. My bad. So you even have escalation templates here that you can copy and make it really easy for you to do. Well, all right. So let's move on. So now once you've done that, now let's talk about what happens and where to go for help. You have many places to get help. Use them. The right place depends upon the question. All right, so on your screen, you have tool questions. So you could use Word, Grackle, UDoIt, Pave. And you can also look on the resource site. You have specific document questions you can drop in for office hours. I am also considered an escalation. If you want to stop in and ask me, I have this document, I don't know what to do with it, blah, blah, blah. I can help you make that determination based on my office hours. Ticketing questions, escalation routing, big picture questions, the DOJ deadlines, system policy. Now, the DOJ deadline doesn't really apply right now because the state of Virginia did not extend the deadline like the federal government did. And because of that, our deadline was actually last Friday. So the deadline has passed. So now everything should be at the 100% compliant place, but it might not be. And then we have the urgent questions. You can email me or you could email your supervisor and just mark it urgent, and then we'll figure it out. So tools and questions, resources first, be specific. If you're stuck, show up. Bring it to me. Bigger picture or questions, email them to me and your supervisor. So bookmark your site, the site I'm going to give you, and you can come back to it as many times as you need. So here is your website that has everything you need. And I'm actually probably going to go ahead and put this, and since I'm already here, let's talk about what's in this website again and why you need to make sure you keep this handy. All right, so this is the website, and you are going to find lots of things. So if you scroll down just a little bit, you have guides, toolkits, tools. Each of these little cards kind of tells you where things are and what you can find there. There's also a tip of the day. There's some who is benefiting from accessibility. If you did not watch uh, or attend the first session, this is where we are. And also, this is a little bit more information that accessibility is not just for people with a disability. It's for everyone. So we have all guides. So on the guides page, we have document structure, we have tables. So when you open these guides, you're going to see there's a little best practice here, and then you can even quiz yourself if you want to. It is not graded, obviously. And you do have a progress bar up here at the top. So when I go back to guides, there we go. We have the PAVE user guide. Now, I want to bring up this because yesterday, no, sometime this week, when we did the moving to or moving from a document to an accessible PDF, we used PAVE. And this document walks you through the process real step by step and make sure that you understand all of the things you need to check when you're in PAVE. It's very detailed. I took a lot of time to build that, so I want to make sure that you knew about it. So now we also have a PDF remediation. So this is talking about adding tags to PDFs. And again, the biggest thing for you to remember is if you don't have access to Adobe, then remediating PDFs is only going to be done in PAVE, unless they've given you something else. So we have images for alt text, did a whole workshop on that already. We talked about captioning and transcripts, color and contrast. If we're on the web or in the canvas, we need hyperlinks, keyboard navigation. This is specifically for anybody who's using a Mac. And then here's a little how-to guide if you want to quiz yourself, and some standards. So if you don't know what the standards look like for WCAG 2.1, this is going to be where you can come to look. AA is the legal standard. This is the minimum is single A, and AAA is not, we are not there yet. So those are the guides. Now in toolkits, that's a little bit different. If you happen to be working with a math course or engineering and you want to come to the STEM accessibility, that's going to help you kind of understand how to do that for those specific subjects. Same thing with arts and humanities, as well as ESL, and then some laboratory. Now, if you happen to be working with staff information, you have faculty information, staff information, and some staff guidelines. These are a bit different, and they're kind of geared for whomever the audience is. Then lastly, we have an accessibility rubric and some decision trees. Decision trees are great if you're not sure. So here's for images, this is for video, documents, and presentations. Tools, now we have lots of tools. We have AI, we have the decision trees again linked here, a tool comparison chart. If you're not sure what that is, it's going to be what tool you could use based on the platform and what it's best for. And you can filter by topic at the top. Let's go back to tools. And then we have making PDFs fillable and accessible. That's a whole topic, but that requires Adobe Pro. This document links to every single guide that I have made. And it also will, again, those are all links. You just have to click on whichever one you want, and it opens a whole document for you. And then we get to the last part of workshops. These are all of the workshops that have been delivered. I will probably put in here I'll build a page for work study, and you'll be able to come here and you can type in work study and it'll be a button at the top. And these are all of the presentations that are related to the topics that I have done in sessions. Finally, the last page is the Get Help. This is where you can find me. You can join my office hours, and they are listed here. They do change, so I highly suggest that you do come back here and visit. We also have some frequently asked questions, and this sends me an email. So that's the entire website. So now let's talk about getting into a rhythm. As a music teacher, we all got rhythm. So a few habits that work well for you all as a worker. Check your email at the start of every work session constantly. Make sure you have some way that maybe your computer makes a sound like mine does, that you know when you get an email. When you're doing opening documents, open the document, make sure you know who it's from. And also, you may want to include that as another column in your spreadsheet. You might want to put down the person's email as part of that. I actually think that's probably a pretty good idea. So that you know exactly who it's going to and what it's for. So I'm going to add a column somewhere. There we go. To the right. All right, so I went ahead and added that email address into the uh, thing. Yep, there's the word. Into the spreadsheet so that that's in there for you as well, but you can add that on your own if you've already made a copy. Uh, but I really feel like that's key and very helpful if you do that. So make sure that you put that information in there. Now, once you've done that, you're going to kind of start thinking about how you can best uh, how you can best use your time. So if you feel like if you feel like you need to put a timer on, you can, but that's not really important. So do your best guess. And for a while, take the time that you need to have and it takes to actually do whatever you need to have done. So don't think 15 minutes and you have to stop. Then make sure you keep an ask in office hours running list if they come up, or come and visit me in office hours, but make sure you do keep a list of the things that you've had to ask. And then take real breaks, brain breaks between any work that you're doing. That's really key for understanding. And then you're going to get stuck, and it's especially going to happen early in the job. So check the resource site first. There is a search tool that you can use. Also, you can ask Gemini or Claude for a starting point. You can ask your supervisor, all of those things. So don't stay stuck for more than 30 minutes without doing something like just using Gemini to help you figure it out. That's perfectly acceptable. And you're going to make mistakes. And I made plenty of mistakes when I started this entire process. I still make mistakes, but failure is the best teacher. If you play video games, you should know that, because that's how you get better. Every time you fail, you remember not to do that again, right? Don't walk on the right side of the swamp, because the guy will get you. The recovery. So note what happened in your documentation log. Make sure you share that log with your supervisor. Ask them what you can fix. And mistakes are not the problem. Hidden mistakes are. If you don't know what to do, it's better to ask. So what to do when you're stuck? Again, here's your 30-minute rule. So try Copilot. When you make a mistake, document it and tell someone. There is a DOJ deadline, and it was April 20th, 2026. Now it's extended to 2027, but that's only the federal. The state rule did not change, and that has already passed. So this is kind of your first week checklist. So bookmark the resource site, save your documentation log to your Google Drive, sign up if you need to, or for another, or stop by an office hour session. Make sure you get used to doing your little ticketing and appropriate, and then also make sure you bookmark anything that's important. So you've learned a lot of information this week. If you didn't know anything about accessibility, I'm sure your brain is full. So you have learned word remediation, PDF export, presentations, captions, alt text, documentation, and escalation. You're not going to remember all of it, not at first, and that's fine. The handouts and the recordings are going to be on the resource site, and you can reference them whenever you need to. What you should remember is this: accessibility work matters, and that's why you were hired. Real students, your peers, are affected by what you do. Faculty will rely on you to do this work as well, and your campus is counting on you to help. You are not just clicking through documents and things, you are making higher education accessible, and that is meaningful work. 2 questions to end with. So, is there any part of accessibility right now that you really are most worried about? And what's one thing you want to remember from any of the trainings from this week? You can type them in the chat. Okay, so okay, yes. So the website, my website is going to be the single place that has everything. You can find other things online, but it's going to be helter-skelter all over the place, hit or miss whether it's going to be correct. So I've spent the time to build the website so that it does contain everything. I did a little reorganization, so if something is difficult to find, that's what I need to know. Um, Anything else anyone else has questions about or thinking about? So this is all of your information. And in the handout that I gave you, I made sure that I put in the link to this presentation. So that's all you need to kind of keep in mind. I will be sending out, again, I will put on the website, I'm going to build a page under workshops, and you're going to be able to find all of the work study information on its own page. So it will have a handout, a practice document, and a link to the video that will be in YouTube. So if you need to go back and review anything, that's where you will find it. So remember that you are doing meaningful work, even when it can be very frustrating. And I promise you, you will be frustrated, but that's okay. That's normal. So thank you again for attending all of the sessions this week. And again, if you have problems, you know where to find me. And you have my email as well as my office hours. And thank you very much. And I hope everybody has a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you, Paige. Take care.